All right, hello everyone. Welcome to week 3. All right, so the last 2 weeks focused on the 9/11 attack. I hope everybody has a working understanding of kind of where we were prior to 9/11, which then launched us into this new era of homeland security. So on this next section, we're going to focus on various aspects of terrorism. When one thinks about terrorism, it seems like that's a pretty self-explanatory term, right? Everyone's pretty sure they know what terrorism is, what terrorism looks like, and who terrorists are. It's not that simple. There's this old adage, that one person's terrorist is another person's freedom fighter, and this holds true. This is one of the reasons why it's sometimes difficult to gain international consensus on what a terrorist attack is and what isn't a terrorist attack. And then we also have this issue of, this realm of mass shootings. Is a mass shooting or a mass casualty event always a terrorist attack? Well, maybe, right? Depends on your definition of terrorism. Generally speaking, there are terrorist mass shootings, mass casualty events, and there's also mass shootings, mass casualty events that are would not be considered to be terrorism. So as you're probably kind of starting to gather, how terrorism is defined and what is defined as terrorism is very important. So as you'll see in the readings this week, there's a variety of different definitions of terrorism. You would think that scholars, organizations, agencies, and governments would be able to get together at some point and kind of develop this definition of terrorism everybody could agree on. That's certainly not the case. So I'm not going to discuss the reading by Ward or the listing of definitions of terrorism. The main point of those readings is that there are many different definitions of terrorism. The organizational definition of terrorism reading is especially interesting because it lists several different agencies within the United States that have different definitions of terrorism, as well as different legal definitions such as that's included in the Patriot Act. So as you read these things, think about problems that this can cause when you have agencies sorting through intelligence that they've collected or are responding to an incident. Okay, think about how having different definitions of terrorism can impact how those are viewed. So do the definitions matter? All right, so let's talk about the Bruce 2013 article. He does a really good job discussing the broad categories of who would, who would have definitions of terrorism and why they each have their own definitions. So why are there so many different definitions of terrorism? Because, it would seem to be in everybody's best interest to have this universal definition of terrorism. And that's the main argument of the Perry article, is that it would be in the best interest to have this universal definition. While that may be true, like everything else that people are involved in, you have different perspectives and different biases, and that leads to disagreements, which lead to varying definitions of terrorism, because definitions of terrorism fit whatever agenda or perspective is put forth by the agency or the government forming the definition. This is very apparent in Bruce's discussion of the UN attempts at creating a definition of terrorism. They've been trying since the murders at the 1972 Munich Olympics to form this definition of terrorism. Now, if you think about the UN, their task is particularly daunting because of the wide variety of nations that are included in the UN. Each of those nations has their own perspective and their own agenda. Countries don't want to have groups within their borders labeled as terrorists, or they don't want to have groups labeled as terrorists if that country is sympathetic to their goals. So the UN has not been able to really come up with a definition of terrorism. Academic research is another area where no one can agree on a definition of terrorism. This would be a really nice place to start, for organizations and agencies, if academics could agree on a definition, right? Because then there would be like this starting base point that you can move on from, right? But of course they can't. There is some general consensus about certain characteristics that should probably be included in a definition. But so far, there's not a universal definition that academics can use, that they use in their research. Because again, location and worldview play a role in definition of terrorism. All right, so then you have legal definitions. These are important because of the need to prosecute terrorists. If you have definitions that are ambiguous, then that allows loopholes and makes appeals easier, and people get out of charges sometimes. So because terrorism definitions are ambiguous or imprecise, sometimes it's easier easier just to prosecute people under regular criminal laws, because obviously murder, those types of things are illegal. All right, law enforcement agencies also have definitions of terrorism, and they need definitions to justify their actions. Okay, and those definitions are then related to legal definitions. Governments and political parties have definitions of terrorism. Governments and political parties use terrorism definitions for a lot of times for public relations reasons, in order to show people or persuade their electorate that they're taking steps that are necessary to combat terrorism. So they can use these definitions to repress, victimize, demonize their opponents or whatever groups they deem as terrorist. Think about the connotations associated with calling someone a terrorist versus a protester or an activist. Especially terrorist versus activist. You hear those quite a bit. Think about the connotations of that. You call someone a terrorist, that immediately takes you to a certain place. You call someone an activist, now that's a different feel to it, right? And people view those groups or people differently. So just think about that for a minute, and we'll talk a little bit about that again. We'll get down to media here in just a minute. The definition of terrorism also impact terrorist groups. Surprisingly, of course, many terrorists don't view themselves as terrorists, right? They view themselves as freedom fighters, insurgents, revolutionaries, whatever term you want to call themselves. But most of them do not view themselves as terrorists. So they also have their own definitions of terrorism that they use to excuse their actions. What we do, that's not terrorism, but what this group over here does, now that's terrorism, and that's a terrible group. And the government should do things to repress them, but not us, because see, we have this own definition of terrorism that we're obviously not terrorists because of our definition. All right, so then now the media also has definitions of terrorism. Now the media is very, very influential because the media can persuade people to view something as terrorism or not as terrorism, someone as a terrorist or someone not as a terrorist, very much in the same way that governments and political parties can do it. But the media reaches even more people. So depending on what the definition of terrorism the particular media outlet is using, that will persuade people, because the public probably has no idea what definition of terrorism that media outlet is operating under. And it may be completely different than that particular person's definition of terrorism. But if this media outlet says these people are terrorists or that's a terrorist event, then that persuades people and influences people to view particular events or people in a certain way. All right, so the Perry article then explores several of these topics in greater detail. So be sure to read it and think about the issues he presents relative to this large number of definitions. He discusses 22 different versions of a definition of terrorism. So then finally, Tucker discusses the difference between new and old terrorism. So as you read it, think about how those two are defined and whether or not they're actually different, or if they're actually the same but somehow repackaged. And if they are, why the different definitions? Like, why are we having to talk about these things differently if they're really not any different? All right, so with that, I'm going to end for this week. Be sure to do all the assignments for this week, and I will see you next week.